Jazz blues is an amazing sound. It was one of the first things that got me interested in jazz, and I still remember being completely blown away the first time I heard Charlie Parker and Joe Pass play amazing jazz blues solos. But for years I struggled to capture that same sound. In this video I'm gonna show you the simple steps that finally unlocked it for me, so that you can start playing real jazz blues. This took me years to figure out. Jazz blues licks and vocabulary are very different from the bebop ideas that I was working on at the time. I was focused on playing chromatic phrases and long flowing lines. And check out how this incredibly simple line sounds a lot more like jazz blues. In this video, I'm going to break down why these two approaches sound so different and how melody, phrasing and rhythm all come together to create that jazz blues sound. Now, another important point is that jazz blues is not the same as regular blues. For example, if you listen to how Wes Montgomery plays a blues solo, it's very different from the phrasing and feel of someone like Albert King. The tempo, phrasing and techniques are completely different. This isn't about one being better than the other. They're both great, but I don't want Wes to sound like Albert King or the other way around. That wouldn't really make any sense. Now, when I first got into jazz, I tried to use the vocabulary that I knew, stuff that I picked up from Clapton, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Albert King, but that sound didn't translate to jazz blues at all. Surprisingly, the solution wasn't about adding complexity, it was about simplifying things. And as you will hear in Wes' solo, a few simple concepts can instantly make your jazz blues solo sound a lot better. When building a solid jazz blues vocabulary, one of the most effective things that you can do is limit the amount of notes that you use. Bebop lines on an F7 chord are often packed with chromaticism, arpeggios and extensions. But for jazz blues, it's much more about phrasing and rhythm than cramming in a lot of notes. To get that sound right, it's better to keep it simple. In fact, the basic triad of the chord is often all you need. For a blues in F, start by using the basic triads for the first two main chords. So really simple, I'm just using an F major triad for the F7, and of course for B flat 7, then I'll use a B flat major triad. Notice how everything is grounded in the core sound of the chord, really low in the triad. Later in this video I'm going to show you how to expand on this with a pentatonic scale approach, but for now we're really just focusing on the essentials. This next example from Wes clearly demonstrates two things about jazz blues phrases, even if he's not using the triads. Pay attention to the length of the phrases and the rhythm. If you compare these phrases to a typical bebop line, then it's easy to hear that this is completely different. Wes isn't playing long flowing streams of eighth notes. Instead, the phrases are a lot shorter and he's really focusing on using quarter notes a lot more, like this. This is less about the constant eighth note flow that bebop lines emphasize, and to capture this sound, try limiting yourself to the notes of the triad and avoid playing long runs of eight notes. Here's a simple example of what that might sound like before we add any phrasing. Notice how these lines stay within a small range, almost entirely within an octave. And that is important because if you just run up and down the triads, it won't sound like jazz blues. And later in the video, I'm going to show you how to expand on this with a pentatonic scale approach. But for now, we're focusing on the essentials. You need to focus on creating simple, rhythmically interesting phrases. Another thing that you want to try to get in there is the pickups, like this one. Or a few bars later, you have this one, which is also just a single note, but then placed a little bit differently. Melodies that move across bar lines are a part of the sound. And what you want to practice is using simple rhythms and melodies. Don't be afraid to repeat notes. You hear Wes do that as well. So try to create something like this. Or a different kind of pickup and a large interval skip. It really pays off to spend time coming up with phrases like this, maybe even adding a B flat phrase to also work on connecting the different chords. But there is another thing that you also want to add to your jazz blues solos, which will really make them come alive. Phrasing. A huge part of the jazz blues sound comes from how you phrase the notes, and one of the most effective ways to do this is by using grace notes and legato technique to bring your melodies to life. The most important one is slides, and especially sliding into the third. This adds sort of a natural bluesy feel to your phrases and makes even simple melodies sound much more dynamic. But don't stop there, you can of course use slides on other notes as well. Keep in mind that adding grace notes like this is especially useful for phrases that repeat notes. Again, something that you would not use if you're approaching this as a bebop solo. The third is especially great for adding grace notes. And remember, short phrases and simple rhythms. You don't need to overcomplicate things. Here's a great example of how to use these techniques effectively. By practicing lines like this, you're training yourself to play with the right phrasing and rhythm that really define jazz blues. And once you feel comfortable with these techniques, you can start to add more notes and explore new ideas. Now, in the next section, we'll look at some jazz blues hacks that will help you make your solos even more melodic and take your improvisation up a level. Now that you build a solid foundation with triad-based melodies, it's time to expand your vocabulary by adding notes around the triads. These extra notes help create more movement and flow within your lines, while still keeping the focus on the chord tones. The key is to use leading notes that guide the listener's ear toward the chord tones of the triad. Now, another powerful note to include is the flat 7, which works as a signal note to clearly establish the sound of the chord. You can hear that being used at the end of this example. Even though these phrases use more notes, they're still heavily based on the triads. When I play bar 1, I'm still thinking about this triad shape. And of course in bar 2, it's coming out of this. And notice how the E flat at the end of bar 3 is really making it clear that we're playing over F7 and transitioning to B flat 7. Adding extra notes also opens up possibilities for more interesting and motivic melodies. Here's an example of a motif that moves from F7 to B flat 7. And notice how slides are used on some of the repeated notes to make the phrase even more dynamic. To really get the hang of this, you'll need to compose your own lines. Spending time constructing phrases that sound good and also connect well across the changes will give you a much deeper understanding of how it works. And it's much better than just noodling over a backing track. Now, there's also a trick involving a pentatonic scale that makes navigating the changes even easier. Let's explore that. When it comes to jazz blues, there is a powerful tool that bridges the sound of blues and jazz very well. The major pentatonic scale with a blue note, sometimes referred to as the major blues scale. In F, that will be something like this. The trick here is to use a phrase based on this scale on F7 and really emphasizing the major third A. So that could be something like this. And when you move to B flat 7, then you can create a variation of that phrase by simply lowering the A down to an A flat. But in this case, that also shifts the grace note down a half step. When you think about the B flat 7 line, you can imagine it as coming from an F minor 6 pentatonic scale, which looks like this. But I don't really approach this as switching scales. Instead, I'm really just seeing it as an F major triad morphing into an F minor triad and then just building the phrase around that. This approach makes it easy to create melodic lines that flow naturally across the changes, which is something that you hear from greats like Charlie Parker and Wes Montgomery. Here's how this concept sounds in a connected phrase. And as I said, there are famous examples of this as well. Check out this great example of how Wes uses this. You can also really hear the major pentatonic sound in these lines with the phrase starting on the D. In this example, Wes starts with an F7 phrase and then develops that into a B flat 7 phrase. And And notice how it's really just two notes moving down a half step. So you have the leading note into the A, which then becomes a G moving into an A flat on the B flat 7. The jazz blues scale isn't just useful for blues, it can also add a subtle blues flavor to a jazz standard. It's like having an entirely different sound to throw in there instead of the normal bebop approach. One of the coolest things about jazz blues is how it can be added to places where you wouldn't usually expect it. It's surprising, but you still recognize it. Now, to make it sound natural, you need to know where to place it, especially when you're starting out. And to demonstrate this, let's use a well-known standard, All of Me. Now, you probably already know and play this song. Typically, it's in the key of C major, so we need to transpose the pentatonic scale to fit into that key. Now, luckily, that's pretty straightforward. Here's the scale we'll use. When you're beginning, it's a good idea to focus your jazz blues phrases on the tonic chords, but another good place is in fact also the turnaround. Now, these spots makes it easier to hear and integrate the sound without it feeling out of place. Now, here's an example of a jazz blues phrase applied to All of Me on the tonic chord at the beginning of the form. Another great spot for adding jazz blues is on the turnaround at the end of the form. Just ask Barney Kessel. For example, you could play a bebop line over D minor 7, G7, but then switch to a blues phrase over the 1-6-2-5. This creates a great contrast and lets the blues phrase flow naturally without worrying about every chord change. Here's how that sounds on All of Me. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but there is one Joe Pass jazz blues that completely blew my mind the first time that I heard it. And I spent hours transcribing and learning it because the phrases are absolutely incredible, both in terms of jazz blues vocabulary and chord solo techniques. I talk about some of the best phrases in this video, and this is one of the best examples of jazz blues that I have ever heard. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.